Okay, everybody, I think we are ready to restart. So just as a reminder, this is our second session of student papers, and these are only 20 minutes long. So just like yesterday, we asked questions to be limited to clarifying questions, at least for the first 10 or 15 minutes, and to postpone other questions for later. And we start with Guillermo from PSE.
Thanks. Thanks to the organizers for including the paper, and thanks for everyone for being here. So this paper is about, it's a nice transition from the previous presentation. It's also about identity. It's also about place-based identity. And I'm going to be looking instead of between places within a city. Okay, so slightly different. So the motivation is the following. So we know that in basically every big city in the world, right, there's marginalized and affluent neighborhoods. And apparently, according to archaeologists, this is a universal feature in all history of humankind, right? And as economists, we care about neighborhoods, right? There's plenty of literature, especially in the developed world or industrialized countries, about how important are neighborhoods for human capital formation and afterwards for later incomes. And of course, I mean, most of these papers have seen how kind of like structural factors, right? Human capital in the sense of schools, crime, amenities. But also more recently, we kind of start to understand that even when this is the case of like growing up in a bad neighborhood might harm you, there's barriers to move to opportunity. And some of these barriers might be just informational frictions or local ties. But more recently, there's papers trying to study the social side of neighborhoods, right? How peers matter, how networks matter, spatial proximity. So in this kind of like spirit, my question over here is what if we think about neighborhood identity? And what do I mean with the neighborhood identity? Over here, I don't have to define social identity, but probably going from a broader definition of social identity, then something that environmental psychologists have used, which is place identity. Again, very similar to what Edgar just explained, identification with a place through interactions and lived experience. And you can think about potentially many place identities, right? The nation, the region, your county, or your neighborhood, right? So I'm going to define neighborhood identity as the identity or attachment to a place, a couple of blocks. You can think about it as a group of blocks that form a zip code or something a bit more blurry, right? And two things that the environmental psychologists have pointed out that are very important is this idea of symbolic boundaries, right? There is basically a boundary where I cross and I'm not in my neighborhood, right? Or at least define our differences. And also something very interesting that there's path dependence in these identities, in the sense that probably here, to take an example of London, Whitechapel long ago was a very important place, right? Probably the identities has changed a little bit, but there's some path dependence of this idea of this place. So the open question over here is whether these neighborhood identities actually influence economic behavior or not. And the two specific research questions that I'm going to be studying in this paper is, do neighborhoods subject to historical segregation show differential educational patterns today? And secondly, can these deep-rooted neighborhood identities can mediate or explain partly this persistent effect? So I'm going to be looking at the city of Guadalajara. This is the second biggest city in Mexico. And from what you can see on the map, this is only the municipality of Guadalajara. I'm plotting years of schooling. You can see a clear divide between the west and the east in terms of human capital accumulation. This looks very similar in terms of income or proxies for income. And something interesting, I'm from this city, and growing up over here, there was a very interesting narrative that the organization or the equilibrium of the city, it was because when the Spanish founded the city, they located on the left part of the little creek that was over here. And when they settled indigenous population on the right-hand side of this little creek. So the story is the city is just like this because this was the foundational act of the city. And people define themselves basically from which part of the city they're from. Nowadays the creek is gone, there's an avenue over here called Calzada Independencia, and people ask you from which part of La Calzada you're from. Are you from this part or you're from the other? Okay? So I'm gonna exploit this setting, which I'm gonna show that it's a nice historical natural experiment where I have this data on the location of the creek, and I have this division between conquerors and local indigenous population. I don't want to say like it's just a question about Spaniards versus indigenous, because with the Spaniards, they brought basically a group of indigenous population from the center of back then New Spain, conquering the northern territories. So these guys over here were also indigenous, but they were conquerors. And these guys over here were indigenous communities living in the nearby areas. I'm going to show you that something interesting compared to other cities in Mexico is basically this was an empty space. There were no pre-colonial agglomerations. Think about Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. That was a huge city by the time that the Spaniards came. Over here, there was nothing. Locational fundamentals are basically the same between the two sides. And think about, if you can see over here, this is like 400 meters. So the difference in terms of the distance between each of the settlements is at most 1 kilometer. So everything is like super balanced between the two sides. And also something very nice is that in terms of institutions, these three settlements have been sharing the same formal institution that belonged to back then, the Audiencia of Guadalajara, nowadays the Municipality of Guadalajara. So I'm kind of like ruling out some potential mechanisms of persistence that have been pointed out in the literature. And what I'm going to do is use this creek as a boundary to show you two set of results and talk about something that I'm currently doing. The first result is that basically this shock defined the entire equilibrium of the city. So now I'm showing all the metropolitan area, not just the municipality, and basically you can see that it follows the same pattern. And something interesting over here is that this shock that's basically the seat of the city, so preceded every other shock in terms of migration or the location of industries that potentially can define the equilibrium of the city. The second thing that I'm going to show is, of course, if I compare people living here with people living here, there's completely different context, right, in terms of housing prices, public goods. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go towards the boundary, nowadays the avenue, and see what happens with years of schooling. You can still see the negative gradient, right, going from west to east. And what happens is that if you just cross this avenue in terms of 750 meters, you will still find discontinuities in human capital accumulation. More specifically, what I find is that there's a lower probability that young people continue with high school, and this is persistent across different cohorts. Again, something interesting over here is back then this was a division in terms of the racial identities. Nowadays, less than 3% of the population in the municipality defines themselves as indigenous. So basically that dimension is gone. I will show you that very interestingly at this part, there was a convergence in terms of amenities and public goods. So the municipality spent a lot of money to try to provide schooling, paved streets, and many other amenities at this fine grid level. And again, institutions have been the same. Some potential issues over here is that, of course, it could be that prices are a bit different. That's the case, but even controlling for housing prices, my results hold. Also something about selective migration. I cannot follow individuals kind of like migration patterns within the city, but I do some strategy that I show that actually, if you plot over here the probability of finding the same person within the same block 10 years ago, the image reverse. So it's more likely to find people staying in place for longer periods of time. And also this is robust parental education. Well, what I want to, if I have the time, what I want to tell you is something also very interesting over here. There's this idea of the neighborhood identity. So people living in this neighborhood, Analco, which literally means on the other side of the creek, they tell stories about how this neighborhood was founded during the colonial period, and this was indigenous neighborhood. So what I'm doing currently is designing a survey and a field experiments to first measure this neighborhood identity, and second, see if actually there's a group norm to within this group that potentially explains why these people do not go to school nowadays, even though everything else has converged. I'm going to skip the literature in the interest of time, but very interesting papers. Some of the people here have written some of them. So the historical context, again, the Spaniards founded this city from scratch in 1542. Analytical, the local indigenous population, Mexicancingo, the Mexicas and Tlaxcaltecas coming from Mexico City, divided by the San Juan de Dios Creek, as I was mentioning. This division was by a law of the Spanish government, because when Spaniards arrived to the new territories, they basically decimated all the population because of epidemics. So after that, they decided it was a good idea to basically separate these people living closely, but not too close, right? And again, I have some data that this is basically a nice setting to study this. I'm just going to show here the balance in location of fundamentals. So this is a municipality. This is a raster of the altitude. So you basically can see that this is just a value. There's no differences really in any of the things that I can measure, right? At a very fine grid level, right? And all the other measures like potential, like land use in terms of mains or something like that. Unfortunately, the measures are like kind of the size of the municipality, but hopefully we're able to convince you that even if all these things are super smooth in the boundary at a very fine grid level, potentially there's no difference in geography in sites. And of course, over here, something that is very important to say is that this shock, yes, created many things, right? Historical difference, social status differentiation, social differential provision of public goods, but at the same time, they didn't, right? So I'm not claiming that the shock is only created identity and nothing else, but as I will show you later, the interesting thing is many things converge, and the only thing that doesn't seem to, or that persists, so is a persistence and an anti-persistence paper. The only thing that persists is the identity and the educational differences. Also something important over here. So this is the city by the end of the 20th century. You can still see the creek. The city didn't grow a lot during this time. And in the second part of the 20th century, the city grew extensively because of the migration from the rural parts to the urban areas. You now don't see the creek, you now see the avenue. And the interesting thing is that basically this point is a historical downtown, but at the same time it's the central business district where you can find most of the retail, right? Small retail and all the office government buildings and stuff like that. So let's say that it's the gravity of the city in that sense. Important over here with these newspapers examples, just to point out that this idea of from La Calzada para allá, La Calzada para acá, which part of the city you belong. So there's this narrative between the two sides. That's one layer. And the other layer is this idea of identidades barriales or neighborhood identities of these neighborhoods, but other neighborhoods that has similar stories. So what I'm going to show you right now is I'm going to use the intercensus survey, the full count over here, to show you just some correlations at the municipal level. The first thing that I want to show you is that if I regress years of schooling with respect with an indicator, whether yes.
Just a clarification. Is it zoned, so you have to go to the schools within your zone or not?
Excellent question. No, it's not as in the US and other parts. Basically, here people can go wherever they want. And if I have it down, I'll show you that basically the supply of both public and private schools, it's equally distributed between the two sides, at least around the boundary. So yeah, if I put an indicator whether this individual lives in one side of or the other, so they would have on average almost 0.3 standard deviations, which is almost 0.4 less years of schooling. So people on the eastern part of the city have basically complete secondary. That's it. If I regress monthly income, this is personal income. There's a 8% difference between one side and the other. But once I account for the differences in human capital, the differences in income are gone. So most of this division of the city, yes, it's related. Yeah, there's an income division, but most likely explained by these differences in human capital information. So given these results, now, well, this is in a table, this is in a map, and this is how it looked like if I just put it into one dimension, again, from west to east. And if you can see where I'm going now, I'm gonna use the spatial RDD, parametric, optimal bandwidth, segment fixed effects, everything fancy over here. And you can see that going towards the boundary and using all this stuff, I will still find a 0.14 standard deviations, around one less year of schooling, which importantly is incomplete high school, right? This is not only the fact that they have less years of schooling, but this specific fact that they're not going to high school, which potentially could give them more labor outcome opportunities, is something that is quite important. Also, something nice over here is that I can see the different coefficients at different points in the boundary. So over here, the interesting fact is most of the negative effect is driven by this part, which is specifically the division between Spanish, Guadalajara, Indigenous, Analco, but also between Mexicalcingo and Analco, which are these points over here. Yes.
And the ones are missing data.
Over here, yeah, so all these estimations are at the very level using the full census, and I can locate individuals at the block level. Over here, I'm not able to map these blocks because they have kind of like less than 10 people actually living there. So the statistical agency doesn't allow me to do it.
That's just for the block.
Exactly, just for the block. So, but there's less people living here, but there's some people living in this place. And over here, I mean, we can talk afterwards, but I basically show that this discontinuity is robust to a lot of alternative explanations, kind of like the first and most important things that will come into mind, again, like housing prices, the results hold, sociodemographic, there's slightly different, there's slight differences in terms of the demographics of the people, but if I control for that, the results hold. Again, this idea that I was telling you about selective migration, and something that potentially is interesting over here, just to make sure that this is not something that probably, I mean, it could be that any potential street explains this difference. So what I do is this falsification where I move the boundary all around the city, and then I see what are the potential, or what is the estimates, right? This randomization inference estimates. So if I would claim that overall across all of the boundary, the effect will be different of potentially random places, I wouldn't be able to say so. But specifically for these differences, for these points between Analco Mexicalcingo and Analco Guadalajara, again, indigenous versus indigenous and indigenous versus Spanish, it is quite robust to this potential non-randomness. And over here also something interesting is plotting the probability of kids going to school or not. And if I plot it, I mean, if I pull it all together, even kids nowadays are less likely to go to school, even controlling for their parental occupation and years of schooling, right? There's some gendered effects. We can discuss it afterwards. And these human capitals, I can trace them back all the way to 1930 in terms of illiteracy and study. And something interesting over here that I really care about, because it's the only actually quantitative data that I can use, is that from this period, I can see that there's some differential occupations. And why this matters, that's because potentially this explains why there's a persistence on having less human capital, in the sense that if it was very actually straightforward to take one of these occupations, there was no reason probably to go to school, because there were like different public goods provision. So it was actually the opportunity cost of schooling in these cases, it exceeded its returns. So back then, probably it was rational to not go to school. Nowadays, not entirely clear. Just over here with the neighborhood identities, this is some data from the same city, not the place that I'm interested, but I guess it helps at least with the arguments. If you ask people from these similar neighborhoods, how is there neighborhood attachment? If they say that it's quite high, they're more likely to be out of school the other way around. So this, after talking to the people over there and seeing these results, this motivated the idea of doing a survey and a field experiment. I'm using the social identity framework. The only thing that matters over here is what I want to do is basically in the experiment shove the prototypical group attribute, namely if these people believe that it's not a good idea to go to study, this is the thing that I would want to show. So what I will do is basically ask them to choose between a human capital voucher and a grocery voucher. I'm gonna do a standard BDM procedure. And the informational treatment is gonna be that after doing this for a couple of rounds and having actual take-ups, I'm gonna randomly vary the salience of group behavior. So for some people, I'm gonna tell them that the mean take-up of the human capital good was this much, right? I'm gonna also shock a bit using some, I'm gonna shock a bit this mean. I can explain afterwards what. But what I wanna do is I wanna compare if people that see this kind of information, whether they try to reduce the distance in terms of the human capital goods. So if I tell you that a lot of people are taking the human capital good, do you want to do the same? Importantly, what I want to compare is whether this information matters if it comes from your group or from a placebo group, right? If I tell you that it's Mexicans or people from the city. That's basically it. I don't have any more time. I also want to use historical naming patterns. I use the fiestas to also exploit this kind of thing to reconnect with history. Thanks a lot.